Okay, so for those who haven't met me, I'm Evelina Johansson Vedén, and I'm one of the organizers of this, together with Sami and Suvi. And so I just want to welcome you to this second day of the event. I'm going to be very brief now. And this is our second keynote. And we're so happy to have you here. So we have Sara Farris here. And for those who maybe do not know her, you're a political thinker based at Goldsmith. Or would you say that you're or sociologist?
Sociologist,
yeah, political thinker.
Something like
yeah,
that.
Something in between. Yeah. Yeah, and I think you've done so good, important, brilliant work. Like really touching upon a lot of fields. You're like really important for people in gender studies, but also like in migration. You've done really good work on care and social reproduction, nationalism, racism, well, feminist theory, like a lot of things. So. And one thing that I really appreciate with your work is that you write with this kind of clarity and complexity at the same time. So like students love you. So it's always nice to like bring a text from you by you to the students, because it's like they understand it, but still they also understand much more than they did before they read the text. So that I think that's how you should write. Yeah, and maybe you're most famous for your book, In the Name of Women's Rights, The Rise of Feminationalism. And this is a really wonderful book, and I urge you to read it if you haven't. But if you don't have time to read it, you can read your articles as well, because they're also very good. And you're also one of the editors of the Sage Handbook of Marxism that we mentioned yesterday as well, because Beverly was also part of that work with Svenja Bromberg and Alberto Toscano. And this book is such a lifesaver. It's like, it's so wonderful, like when you're thinking about something, like, oh, how can you think about this? Like, what have people done? Like, yeah, then you just go to this book and you read, and then you get a lot of ideas. And yeah, so I love this book. Unfortunately, it's quite expensive. but try to get hold of it. The library, yeah, use the library, order it, kind of. Yeah, just and share it amongst you. Like buy one together, and then you just like have it once a week or something. Yeah, but then they'll only have one copy, you know. So yeah, but it's a great book, and I'm really grateful that you did that work. Okay, so that's it. I'm not going to say much more. I just want to welcome Olivia, and then I asked you about how you pronounce your surname, and now I forgot it. But it's Maury. Yeah, no, what's wrong? Yeah, okay. So you're a sociologist with a focus on migration and labor, and you're at the University of Helsinki. And you will start, then after your 45 minutes presentation, you will come up and give some questions, and then just to open up for discussion amongst all of us. So yeah, so please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I really want to thank Suvi, Evelina, and Sami for organizing this great conference and for inviting me. And really, believe me, I really enjoyed it so much so far, because the discussions have been great. I went to 2 great panels on social reproduction, and they were very informative. I learned a lot from you. And of course, the lecture by Bev yesterday was fantastic. I just don't know how you do it, like being able to look at such an extended period with that clarity and grasping all those dynamics between history and theory. Well, no, it's really a talent. And so thank you so much. And when you were saying, I'm really happy about what you said about the fact that I write clearly, because I really strive to do it. We had a conversation with Bev just a couple of days ago about how I struggle as an Italian speaker. I really struggled a lot to write in English and try to write it clearly, and also abandon the Italian habit of long, convoluted sentences. So thank you for that. I'm really glad about that. Okay, so I am sorry because I had to change the title and the content of my paper for today. I intended to present on the coloniality of social reproduction, because that's a bit of very much work in progress, I should say work at the beginning. That paper would have been largely based on recent work that I have done on care and domestic workers. I interviewed many of them over the last 3 years, employed in care homes, but also I'm very interested in domestic workers organizations. I did interviews with women in Spain, Mexico, different parts. And what is very increasingly interesting for me is really these links between colonialism and social reproduction. That's very clear in the UK, where I said yesterday as well, a lot of migrant women are actively recruited from former colonies. But I really want to think more about that because I wasn't very happy with, I didn't also have much time, to be completely honest with you. And so I decided to instead present this work on gender. So this talk today is very much based on the chapter on gender that you find in the Sage Handbook of Marxism. So I'm not going to, be too detailed on this because you can read it. And if you don't have access to it, because I know it's expensive, I'm very happy to send it to you. So yeah, please. But I will try to reconstruct this debate on gender, let's say in large strokes. So I will try to periodize it in somehow temporarily, chronologically, but more thematically. And so let's see. And also at the end, I want to try to suggest some contemporary challenges and questions that I think we need to address quite urgently. So as I write at the beginning of the chapter, I here also want to begin by saying that reconstructing this debate on gender within Marxism and Marxist feminism is not easy at all, even if, of course, we talk a lot about gender. Actually, if you read carefully, I would say the majority, or in any case, many Marxist feminists are not really talking about gender often. They are talking about women's oppression. So there is a certain conflation of gender and women's oppression. Of course, they are very related, but at the same time, we now understand gender in a way a little bit differently, right? So the modern meaning of gender, if not immediately the term, as you probably know, dates back really to Simone de Beauvoir, the second sex, and particularly the idea that she develops that one is not born but becomes a woman. So this is really this idea of gender. Now, after the publication of de Beauvoir's book, the notion of gender as a social construct, which is not dictated by biological sex constraints, was very much accepted by most feminists, but also somehow uncritically employed by Marxist and socialist feminists. So gender was denaturalized, while sex remained in the realm of nature, whether implicitly or explicitly. The question became not so much what gender or sex is, but in what ways the social construction of femininity is based on and reproduces relations of domination and oppression. And it was really not until the work of Monique Wittig in France in the 60s and 70s, and then Judith Butler, who largely draws on this French tradition in the 1990s, that the category of sex itself, alongside that of gender, is subjected to full political scrutiny. So they try to denaturalize sex as well. So in what follows, however, I want to try to, on this basis, I want to very selectively try to reconstruct some of the main tenets of this complicated history and try to find some organizing criteria. So I divide this history in, I would say there are these 6 general trajectories that I will try to follow. So the first, I will briefly mention what gender is in Marx and early Marxists. I will move to the dual sex and gender system analysis that was mentioned widely because obviously it was very, very important. The links and differences between gender and race, the materiality of gender subjectivity, the debate on gender and capitalism, and finally, transgender Marxism. So let me begin on gender relations in Marx and early Marxists. So there is this entry on gender that Donna Haraway, I didn't know this, but actually when I was writing this chapter on gender, I read it. So in this entry, which she published in 2001, Donna Haraway actually says something a little bit like what I said. It was so difficult to write this entry because because there is really this duality between nature and society that it's constantly present in much discussions on Marxism. But rightly, I think Donna Haraway also says you cannot really find the concept of gender in Marx because he didn't have this more modern concept. However, I think Heather Brown, in a more recent publication, I think it was 2013, I think she did a great job in trying actually to reconstruct the debate on gender and women's oppression within Marx and Engels in particular. And so I would say that even though it is true that Marx didn't have a conception of gender in a modern or even in any systematic way, we can find a lot of comments on relations between the sexes, what we can call gender relations. But I think Marx is also quite interesting in a way in which he understands the ways in which the relations of production and capitalism also really changes femininity. He has actually, not a lot, but he has interesting things to say also about that. So I think there are several comments about gender relations in the early writings, famously in the 1844 manuscripts. You might remember this sentence. He wrote that the relationship between men and women is the benchmark to understand the level of civilization of a society, a sentence that's widely quoted by, to be completely frank with you, I'm not sure it's very clear, but okay, let's leave it there. And instead, I think he makes a lot of very interesting comments in Capital Volume 1, in which basically he writes that the introduction of machinery in the labor process and the subsequent inclusion of women and children in factory work fundamentally changed gender relations within the family. Women and young girls in particular, Marx noted, were employed for the dirtiest and worst paid jobs. And then in the footnotes, Marx quotes long excerpts from factory inspectors' reports that argue that factory work for women led to the deterioration of their character. There was a lot of moralization of what factory work was doing, particularly to young women. Now, these inspectors' reports implied that the subtraction of women from their more natural roles at home had a negative implications for their morality. Now, Marx's own opinion on these reports are not very clear. Sometimes he just didn't comment on them, he just reported these reports. But at the same time, there are passages in Capital Volume 1 in which he seems to suggest that in challenging traditional female roles, factory work could have a deleterious effect on women's morality and gender relations more generally. So he talks about how there was an atmosphere of Sodoms and Gomorrah in these workers' towns because a lot of girls were getting pregnant, the boundaries were completely broken, etc. So he seems to, Heather Brown, for instance, says he seems to be struggling to reconcile his more progressive views with remnants of Victorian ideology. But then, on the other hand, actually, Marx also analyzed how women were used as a cheap and docile labor force to threaten male laborers' bargaining powers, as well as their role as heads of the family. And so Marx regards this as a highly contradictory process with potentially positive effects on gender relations and women's role in particular. So he seems to suggest that in shaking patriarchal authority within the working class family, capitalist social relations could have, at least potentially, an emancipatory role on gender relations, as old roles were challenged and new ones could take shape. So even though he's not discussing these issues in detail, and often he's not presenting his own position in in clear terms. Nonetheless, Marx's understanding of capitalist social relations and gender relations as dialectically tied one to the other indicates a method for analyzing gender roles in more complex ways. Now, this dialectical understanding of relations of productions and gender relations, in a way, according to many commentators, is lost by Engels. So Engels actually does not really follow the more dialectical method that Marx indicates, even in these comments. So as you know, actually, this Engels, who is credited for the Marxist or the Marxian, to be more precise, the position on gender relations, because he, as you know, he wrote The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, in which he argues that, as you know, is the transition to class society that led to a distinct gender division of labor and which disadvantages women. So since its publication, as I'm sure you know, it is really Engels that was constantly referenced as the authority, or was the Marxist word, the Marxian word on gender. However, I would say especially, I mean, there are many discussions of Engels, especially amongst anthropologists, particularly in the 1970s, Leacock, Ilse, a lot of these feminists really discuss it in detail, of course, because Engels' work was based on ethnological material, on anthropological material, even though very problematically so. And more recently, Kevin Anderson, for example, pointed out also some elements of Eurocentrism in these assumptions that you can look at indigenous life in Canada, and from then you can just speak about what happened 2,000 years ago to gender relations, right? So there are obviously problems with Engels' take. But what I find interesting, and this is a comment made by people like Carver and Friggahaug, is that the fundamental flaw in Engels was to establish two autonomous lines of explanation for the social order. So there are economic relations on the one hand and family relations on the other hand. As Carver says, the class war on the one hand and the sex war on the other hand. And Friggahaug, very similarly, in an entry for the German Dictionary of Marxism, she also writes this entry on gender relations, try to speak about what is this debate, especially in Engels. And she writes that Engels had strengthened a mode of reading that to a certain extent comprehended gender relations as an addition to and outside of the relations of production. The history of gender relations as a dimension of the relations of production instead is the task that we have. So this is to say, by writing somewhat these two different histories, this is what I mean. He was not really following Marx, who instead tried to see what factory work, for example, this new division of labor, the ways in which he was transforming femininity and masculinity as well. So in a way, and this again is from the reason why you have Gramsci there, is because Gramsci, in fact, as an early Marxist, is considered to be, by many feminists, one of the few who instead tried to follow Marx's method and understanding how these changes in relations of production have an impact upon gender relations, but also the character, people's character, we can say. And so in his work on Americanism and Fordism, he precisely tried to understand how these changes in productive forces and technologies also change the family norms and the gendered subject formation. So in Gramsci, actually, you can find aspects of these attempt at developing a materialist, historical materialist method for understanding gender relations and relations of production. So what happens next? And now I'm going to jump quite a lot to the 1970s, because, of course, a lot of stuff happens before, but the reason why I'm jumping to this, because I think in many ways, really the key debate on gender then becomes the one on dual sex and gender system analysis that is very much well known for the work of Heidi Hartmann. And I think what's interesting about these identification by Frigga Haug and Carver of the limits of especially Engels' theorizing in their distinction of production and reproduction as two separate realms, clearly hit the target, and I think it's still there in these dual system analysis, theorizations of the 1970s. So, in a way, I think that those debates in the 1970s were also very much the result, you can say, of the split that many feminists within a socialist Marxist organizations experienced in practice. They experienced that split. The comrades were not taking them seriously. As Bev was saying yesterday, you went into these rooms and it was impossible to talk about the feminism of women because gender or women's oppression or the woman question, as it was called, it was the secondary contradiction, right? The primary contradiction was class. And so in that sense, many of these feminists, and Heidi Hartmann was not one of them, but also Christine Delphi, they really say enough is enough, okay? We have probably, this is an unhappy marriage, we just need to, you know, make peace with that somehow. So the first one, however, before Heidi Hartmann was actually Christine Delphi, who is a French feminist who in the 1970s was one of the first to theorize an influential version of this dual system analysis in this article called The Main Enemy. So here Delphi identified unpaid housework undertaken mostly by women as a form of servitude that marked women's subordination to men. And so she theorizes the existence of a patriarchal mode of production of domestic service, or the domestic mode of production, which she conceives as a mode of production different but also parallel to capitalism. And within this patriarchal mode of production or domestic mode of production, women are to men what the proletariat is to the bourgeoisie, the class of the oppressed. So here really begins this idea that there are two different classes, and these really are the class of women and the class of men, and the main enemy is men. Then in 1975, Gail Rubin in the US had a huge influence on this debate because she was also one of the most important sources of inspiration for Heidi Hartmann. And she is the one who introduced this idea, defined this sex-gender system. And according to her, the sex-gender system is the set of arrangements by which a society transforms biological sexuality into products of human activity, and in which these transformed sexual needs are satisfied. And then we have Hartmann, Heidi Hartmann, with The Unhappy Marriage of Marxism and Feminism, published in 1979, who was very much influenced by Gail Rubin, but also Shulamit Firestone, who had published a decade earlier The Dialectic of Sex, and was really trying to understand, okay, what do we make of these distinctions? How can we still understand the woman question or gender relations within Marxism, or we just need to take stock of the fact that the two are just separate systems, and maybe they are patriarchy and capitalism, as they write. They are two separate systems. They are different. We need to understand them differently. So, as I said, Hartmann is very much building on Rubin. She thinks that the sex-gender system, or what she calls patriarchy, is really the key to understand this separate system. But she's also responding to Shulamit Firestone, who had advocated for the abolition of sexual classes and sexual difference through the liberation of women from childbirth. Contra Firestone, according to Heidi Hartmann, the task was not so much to overcome oppression by getting rid of sex difference, but to understand how sex, a biological fact, I'm quoting, becomes gender, a social phenomenon. And as I said, it was especially Rubin's work that she had very much in mind. So in the end, as I said, they understood the patriarchy and capitalism and as two different systems, but this was also a fundamental pitfall within this theorization, as the next chapter in this story I think explains really clearly. So here, when it comes to discussions on gender and race, I think it is especially, to my knowledge at least, African-American scholars like Angela Davis that really question very strongly the dual system analysis, the idea that there is the class of women who are in solidarity with each other and the class of men who, again, are in solidarity with each other. So Angela Davis publishes her famous book, Race, Class, Women, Class and Race, I never remember exactly the order, in 1981, so a couple of years after Heidi Hartman's book. And I mean, Bev said this already yesterday, but this is really, if you haven't read it, and I know people think they know this book because so many people write about it, but if you haven't read it, I really urge you to read this book because it's still so incredibly relevant, informative, profound. It's one of really the best Marxist feminist books. What is, I think, really important about in this context that Davis says is that she really tries to understand what happens to masculinity and femininity, so to gender formations, in light of slavery, of what happened to African people in the slave trade. So in many ways, according to Davis, slavery, and obviously she sees the legacy of slavery in race relations in the United States and gender relations, according to Davis, slavery had been characterized by the absence of gender formations, in the sense that, according to her, women and men in many ways were genderless. So, and here I'm quoting, I'm sorry it's a little bit long, but I think it's really important and clear. She writes, "The slave system defined the black people as chattel. Since women, no less than men, were viewed as profitable labor units, they might as well have been genderless, as far as the slaveholders were concerned. In the words of one scholar, the slave woman was first a full-time worker for her owner, and only incidentally a wife, mother, and homemaker. Judged by the evolving 19th century ideology of femininity, which emphasized women's roles as nurturing mothers and gentle companions and housekeepers for their husbands, black women were practical anomalies." So ultimately, the ideology of bourgeois femininity that associated women with domesticity and caring was completely alien to black women. And so such an ideology allocated women to the essential but inferior world of motherhood and housewifery, which hold true also for white working class women at certain stages of capitalist accumulation. However, the economic arrangements of slavery first, but also later, the fact that black women had always worked, they were really never subjected to these ideas and ideals of domesticity, really made these ideas of gender that had been developed within many, often these white feminist circles, completely not intelligible for many African-American feminists and Marxist feminists. So in this sense, responding to Heidi Hartman's provocative article on the unhappy marriage between Marxism and feminism, there is also another important, I think, Marxist feminist in those years, writing, Gloria Joseph, who is not very well known, but actually I think she makes very good points when she writes that the black woman and the black women and men experience is a shared history of brutalization and dehumanization that brought them together instead of dividing them. So responding to the idea that women are a class and they are all in solidarity with each other, and the same goes for men, actually she says, Gloria Joseph writes, "Capitalism and patriarchy simply do not offer to share with black males the seat of power in their regal solidarity. There is more solidarity between white males and females than between white males and black males," which I think is really such an important point that, in a way, I think closes the discussion on dual systems and the idea of interclass and interracial solidarity. Another point, a very important point that I think the African American feminists and Black Marxist feminists more generally make is that there is a tendency, particularly within a certain orthodox Marxism, to conflate also gender and race as if they are the same thing, as they are treated as the secondary contradiction, as if, you know, more or less they both naturalize people's roles in society, and therefore they are considered to be very similar processes. And these scholars, and here I have in mind Bhavnani and Colston, but I know also Bev writes something very similar, they say you cannot really conflate gender and race. They are completely different experiences, but they also respond to very different political logics. So we need to understand them. I think this is still a point of discussion. And so I think the question of how racism, for example, shapes gender identity and how gender is experienced through racism and class is shaped by gender and race remains some of the fundamental questions that we still have to confront today. Not so much because we have to reveal some kind of truth that's hidden behind this, but because also they change, right? Historically, they change, they are transformed continuously with the changes of capitalism. The other tradition is probably not the right word, but the other, let's say, set of scholars and concerns that I want to address relate to what I would call the materiality of gender subjectivity. So until now, I try to show you how the main debate was about more or less, okay, so what are gender relations? How is gender different from class? How is patriarchy different from capitalism? In what ways are gender relations and gender, to less extent subjectivity, shaped by these relations of production and changes in the labor process? So these were some of the questions. There is a new now wave of Marxist feminist scholars, I would say, that starts to develop more the modern concept of gender. So the idea that in which we understand more gender now, which is precisely this idea of gender as a social construct, but also as a spectrum, right? That tries to challenge this binary of gender as femininity and masculinity, but also of gender as a kind of superstructure of a stable sex, a natural sex. And so the first author here is really Barrett, Michelle Barrett. I will not talk too much about Juliet Mitchell, who in 1974 published Psychoanalysis and Feminism, because, I mean, she uses psychoanalysis to try to reconcile Marxism and feminism, but I think the central point here is very complicated, so I don't want to go too much into that, actually. But what I will say is just that she, in the end, tries to understand gender as ideology, and that's very much what Michelle Barrett does in this amazing book that was reprinted by Verso just a few years ago, which is actually was published in 1980, and it's Women's Oppression Today. So I remember when I was writing this entry, and I read it because I had not really read it closely before, I was astonished, because you can disagree on a lot of grounds, but it's really such an important book. It's really profound. She really was trying to understand this gender as ideology in a very, very profound way. So, you know, as I said, there are aspects with which I disagree, and she's been very much criticized for this work as well, for this understanding of ideology. She was very much drawing on Althusser and thinking of ideology as this generality in many ways, and she's been accused of this. But at the same time, as I said, I think it is really a book that it's still relevant and it's still worth engaging with. So in general, Barrett defined ideology as a generic form for the processes by which meaning is produced, challenged, reproduced, and transformed. And so for her, such ideological processes have an integral connection with the relations of production, as becomes clear in the case of the capitalist division of labor and the reproduction of labor power. For Barrett, however, the point is not to understand the ideology of gender and women's oppression as simply a function of capitalist relations of production, but as a set of ideas and representations of femininity and masculinity that predated capitalism, that have been well embedded within capitalist social relations. And so one of the reasons why she's been criticized is also for this idea that ideas of femininity and masculinity and ideas of women's inferiority were not invented by capitalism, they were pretty much there before. And what Barrett says is it's important to acknowledge this, but she says at the same time we need to understand how capitalism in a way imports and embeds these ideas. So one of the reasons she's been criticized is for not fully developing the idea of the historicity of gender and how capitalism not just embeds but transforms these gender ideologies. So Barrett is very important for, I think, trying to think more deeply this idea of gender relations, femininity, what is it, what does it do within capitalism, and I think after Barrett, we have quite a number of works that also try to understand these elements, even though they do not necessarily agree with Barrett. So we have the work on gender and sexuality as consumption from the 2000s on, the work by Rosemary Hennessy, that in many ways, she writes a book published in 2000 called Profit and Pleasure, Sexual Identities in Late Capitalism, in which she tries to understand the shift from an understanding of gender as the binary, femininity, masculinity, to gender as synonymous with sexual identity and as oriented towards an object of desire. So according to Hennessy, this shift in gender as sexuality is symptomatic of changes in late capitalism in which people become consumers, and so they are confronted with free choice. So she says basically, sexuality becomes one of the other options on the market of sexual identities. That's, in a way, the idea she develops. This idea was very influential for the late Kevin Floyd, who published his book, The Reification of Desire, I think it was 2012, in any case, quite recently, and this book is really, again, great. You can disagree with a lot of things. Some parts of this are a little bit obscure, I would say, but I think there are so many interesting suggestions in this book by Kevin Floyd. So one of the things, what he tries to do in this book is he's trying to analyze how the de-skilling of male labor that characterized the advanced stages of capitalism in the early 20th century with the transition to Fordism and Taylorism. So this has profound implications, especially for masculinity. So he talks of the transition from manhood to masculinity. And he says, before the 19th century, before Fordism, the real category, the gender category was manhood, and manhood, the opposite of manhood was childhood. And he says instead, in the 20th century, with the transition to Fordism and Taylorism, we see that there is this movement to masculinity in which a pivotal to this transition is actually the dissociation from femininity. And according to him, now that men are increasingly de-skilled within factory work, they are required to abide to a heteronormative gender regime of performance in different ways. These requirements to masculine men are strictly linked to the de-skilling of labor, as I said. So manhood in the 19th century was a reflection of an economic period in which industrial manufacture still demanded skilled male labor. Masculinity instead is the product of the de-skilling of labor that occurs in the 20th century. The skilled labor as work is matched by the requirements of consumption at home, and consumption patterns are now entirely geared towards masculine males and feminine females. So the drill for DIY, for example, he makes this example of the DIY drill that enables suburban white men to perform the illusion of skilled labor at home, while their wives take pleasure in the kitchen mixer, for example, to perform caring tasks and femininity. So I think there's something so interesting about the way in which he tries to understand these changes in really in gender, shall we call them identities, subjectivities, and these changes in modes of accumulation, if you want. Another interesting author here is Jordana Matlon, which also tries to address gender and sexuality as consumption, but she does it in the context of racial capitalism in Africa. So basically, she writes that in this context, this had meant, on the one hand, that ideals of male breadwinner, of the male breadwinner provider for a lot of unemployed black men in Africa is increasingly unavailable to them. They cannot be the breadwinners. But at the same time, successful black masculinity has become the new ideal which is performed by black African men through overconsumption. And the identification with a masculine capital owner male ideal, which is unattainable for most of them, has led to what Matlon calls complicit masculinity. And I think what she's really interesting also about Jordana Matlon's work is how she draws on Gramsci and the idea of consent, in fact, precisely to say we need to understand how these working class black masculinity is responding to these new patterns of consumption offered by capitalism. And then, of course, Bev did a lot of work, and this is the final strand I'm just going to consider briefly. Gender, it's a class deformation. And I think we said that a lot of times, but you really need, if you haven't already, you really need to read Formations of Class and Gender, because it will transform your lives and the way you understand introductions. I was telling Bev the other day, her introduction really was, like for me was, wow, that's how it should be written. So I'm not going to speak too much about this. I mean, obviously, I'm sure you know this work, and Bev talked a bit about this yesterday. But I think what's very important here is that, in a way, Bev is really building on Marx's idea that I said at the beginning. How do we understand these transformations in gender relations and ideas of femininity, in this specific case, in the context of changes in family and relations of production and the workplace? So for Bev, gender subjectivity is really an empty abstraction if detached from class. But to understand gender as a class formation, we need to foreground the ways in which ideals of femininity and masculinity from the 19th century onwards were both circulated as moral codes for respectable behavior and built upon classed bodies. So in this sense, gendered classed formations are also sensuous constellations. I really love the way she speaks about this, in which it is the body itself, the shape of the body, its smell, clothing, gesturing, that functions as a proxy for class, thereby foregrounding class subjectivity as the result, but also the process for the internalization of class morality. Now, the next debate I want to, I hope I'm not taking 5 minutes left. Okay, I'll do my best.
You can get 10.
Okay, I'll really do my best. I'm really going to my conclusions, I mean, kind of. So this is not the last, but a very recent debate that I want to mention here, I've also been involved personally in this debate, is the one on gender and capitalism, that in many ways was, I would say, initiated by Ellen Maxine Wood, but somewhat revamped by Cinzia Arruzza. So really, in a nutshell, the position of Ellen Maxine Wood in her work in the 1990s, some of her works, was fundamentally that capitalism is kind of indifferent to gender and class. So she writes this very clearly. I'm going to quote, "If capital derives advantages from racism or sexism, it is not because of any structural tendency in capitalism toward racial inequality or gender oppression, but on the contrary, because they disguise the structural realities of the capitalist system and because they divide the working class." So she's saying very clearly, you know, capitalism can very easily do without racism and sexism. She's not really trying to underestimate the importance of racism and sexism, but she's saying, you know, fundamentally, capitalism just needs exploitation, and it doesn't really care who is exploiting. It can exploit women, black people, it doesn't really matter. Now, a very similar position, as you might know, is also shared by David Harvey. He writes along very similar lines. Now, in 2014, I think, Cinzia Ruzza published this longer text in Viewpoint magazine, Remarks on Gender, where she takes on this thesis by Ellen Maxine Wood, and in fact it's Cinzia that calls it the indifferent capitalism thesis. And she tries to say fundamentally, Ellen Maxine Wood is wrong. I disagree with this. I think actually we need to understand gender as not just important for capitalism, but as a fundamental contradiction of capitalism. Capitalism needs sexism, gender oppression, and racism. But she says, yeah, maybe we can't really explain it at this high level of abstraction at which Ellen Maxine Wood wants to explain capitalism, which is the fundamental. I mean, for me, Ellen Maxine Wood is a Weberian in some ways in this, because she has this ideal type, like many political Marxists, of capitalism as this marketplace in which you have the buyer, right, of labor power and the seller of labor power, and that's capitalism. And I'm like, well, maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? So anyway, in this debate, we were invited by the journal, myself, together with Joanna Oksala, who is an amazing Foucault scholar. I really love Joanna's work. She always tries to engage from a Foucault perspective with Marxism, and also Francesca Manning. We engaged with this debate with Cinzia. There were disagreements. I, for example, said no. We need to engage also at this level of abstraction, trying to demonstrate why capitalism needs gender oppression and racism. And I try to say perhaps one way is to consider the more political dimensions of capitalism, and not just this idea that capitalism is just this economic ideal type in the marketplace. And I try to say perhaps what the nation state is and what it does to social reproduction and the women, the regulation of women's bodies is one key to try to understand it. Anyway, I mean, I'm very passionate about this debate, and it's very interesting. Again, you can read it. It's all there. I put the titles. It's available online, so you can read it. I think, again, this is one of the most, for me at least, exciting debates. I think, I mean, I'm not sure any longer that, you know, we need to be too complicated and really, I mean, in a way, Cinzia says something interesting when she says, we don't necessarily need to get from these high levels of theory the justification for which we need to fight sexism, which I think it's a good point, right? But anyway, I'll come back to that. The final one I really want to address, because I know we don't have time, but I think it's super interesting, is actually transgender Marxism. So I think this is from a couple of years ago, maybe a little bit earlier, 2020. This book was published by Pluto Press, Transgender Marxism, which I think here I wrote from queering Marxism to Marxing Judith Butler, because what they try to do in this book, first of all, these scholars at least, they all agree, I mean, they think Judith Butler really is a fundamental point of reference for these debates, especially because she's the one who, she was one of those who denaturalized sex. And I think this is such an important point to understand also gender. And I think there are two interesting aspects here that I will mention super briefly. One is the intervention by Jordi Rosenberg, who tries to understand transgender Marxism by engaging with the concept of metabolism in Marx. And they say we really need to work through this concept to understand the metabolic exchange between human beings and nature, which is also so fundamental to discussions on sexuality, gender, as a spectrum, as fluid, etc. And the other thing that I found really interesting is the way in which they draw on contemporary histories. You know, in the last 10 years or so, maybe more, there appeared a number of books looking at the history of medicine, for example, in the United States, and what happened to gender transitioning, and how doctors really were confronted with babies that could not be easily classified as either female or male. And so a lot of this discussion, transgender Marxism, basically say, you know, even modern contemporary medicine now admits that this binary is not as rooted in nature as we used to believe. It's not just about, you know, reproductive apparatuses and genitalia. It's much more complex. It's really much more fluid. And so they think, which I think is a bit of a provocation, but is also interesting, that the real binary was gender. And so this gendered idea of femininity and masculinity as a somewhat solid and firm for characters and personalities was applied to these intractable variations in sex. So it was trying to, through assigning a gender to these complex sexed bodies, they were trying to give some stability to these instability, which I think is a very interesting point. Anyway, these are really my conclusions. I said we have some contemporary challenges that I think are exciting and important. The first one, I think, is intersectionality, in the sense that, you know, I think intersectionality, a lot of Marxist feminists criticize intersectionality, and I agree with many of these criticisms. But at the same time, I think, I mean, first of all, there is also a lot of intersectionality ante litteram, I mean, before Kimberly Crenshaw, like Angela Davis, that are Marxist engagements with the issue. And so I think intersectionality is such an important challenge for Marxist feminism, because it really forces us to think through these complex relationships, right? Class, gender, race, okay. I think another important challenge is the commodification of care, or the commodification of social reproduction. A lot of writings in Marxist feminists fundamentally assume that gender oppression is due to the social and reproductive role of women. Women were segregated at home as unpaid, unwaged workers, and from this, because of the devalorization of social reproductive labor, derives also the oppression within capitalism. I think, of course, this is important, an important history, but I think we also need to come to terms with the increasing commodification of this labor. And so what does it mean? It's not long, I mean, of course, a lot of women still do unpaid social reproductive labor at home, but there is a lot of this going on outside the household in commodified forms, performed by migrant and racialized women. That is a lot part of my work. And this is, again, very interesting to think gender, because a lot what is happening through the outsourcing of reproductive labor to wage the migrant and racialized women is also that, in a way, traditional gender roles are reproduced for these racialized women. So while, if you want, middle class, white or non-racialized women, or more, I don't know how to call them, more privileged women can undo gender by, you know, being waged workers, sometimes the breadwinners. It is the migrant women who have to reduce gender, because they are the ones cleaning, cooking, doing the laundry, etc. And finally, I think, again, an important challenge, which is very close to also to what I try to do, is to understand the ways in which gender is increasingly a battlefield, the political battlefield, particularly for the far right. So why is gender so central to the far right at the moment? They are mobilizing it. They are the ones talking about the West and gender equality. Obviously, we all know it's a very hypocritical, it's very conservative, but at the same time, they are really engaging in a very complicated discussion with gender that I think, on which I think we should do more. We need to understand this a little bit more. So yeah, I will close it here. Thank you, and sorry for taking too much time.
Okay, so Olivia.
I'll sit here.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was very inspiring and very broad. So I struggled to find the right points of discussion. But yeah, it's been wonderful to listen to you also yesterday during the workshops, and you gave so I think thoughtful and humble comments to every paper that we heard. So it's been really great, and now to hear your own views on gender and Marxism. And I wonder where to start, but I think I start from a very simple question, and then we'll move on to the more complex ideas that you also now towards the end of your talk brought up concerning social reproduction and work today and these sort of questions. But to me, when I read your paper and heard you talking here today, you talk about gender and Marxism. And when I think about Marxist feminism, one of my first references are Silvia Federici's work and other feminists in relation to her work. So I was thinking, is it a conscious choice to leave this stream out, or how did you build your text and presentation for this? Because I think it's wonderful and really interesting. This is just something I thought of when reading it.
Oh, you want me to respond immediately?
I have many questions, but maybe if you...
Do you mind if
okay.
you... Because if I start answering, I don't want to speak too long.
Yes. Well, the second point is that going from, you discuss in the chapter, going from female as the expression of the realm of nature and the biological determinism that Maria Mies criticized Marx of because of the separation of production of new life, that is reproduction, and production of daily requirements through labor. And I think these are, even though we consider these debates very old and sort of relegated to the past, these debates between production and reproduction are still very much ongoing. So I wonder to what extent you consider productive labor being distinguishable from reproductive labor, or do we need to draw the line in analytical terms or to understand social reproduction and the importance of Marxist feminist thought today? Further, I think when we discuss older debates of Marxist feminists, it's it tends to very much emphasize the power of men. And Hartman says that women's oppression lies in men's control over women's labor. And I think many things have changed, as we all know. And I think there is much power in the feminist thought and feminist struggles that have shown that it isn't the case always anymore. But I also think of working life as becoming more and more feminized, both in number, also in character, with more emphasis on emotional and affective aspects of work, digital work and service work, but also in the organization of work that more and more resembles housework, with less and less minutes of the day being paid for, with work that never ends. So we could talk about, and some researchers also talk about, housewifization in larger terms. So do you think this is a fruitful way of looking at labor relations today from a feminist point of view, or in which ways do you see that these Marxist feminist conceptualizations help us to think of work today, for example, in relation to your work on care? I wonder how much do we start here, or I have several questions still, but
yeah, you can. I mean, how many questions?
Yeah.
If you read them all quickly, then Sara can choose
can
which she would like to reply to and how and in what
Yeah.
order.
Difficult to read them all quickly.
Okay, sorry. That's a lot.
But maybe two then.
Yeah,
I think that's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
yeah. And well, yeah, in the end, you talk about the indifference capitalism thesis, Arutza, and gender as being fundamental for capitalism. It's that capitalism does need sexism and racism, and you also mentioned the nation state and social reproduction, and that it is a passionate debate. So I would really like to hear a little bit more about it, drawing on your thoughts about the debates. How do you think we can struggle against capitalism that is tied to gender and race? Because I think especially in relation to transgender Marxism and trans scholars more generally. For example, I've been myself quite influenced by the scholar Marcus Bay, who writes about that we can't construct boundaries of genders and name them all, because what we are looking for is something that is still unknown. We want to leave these old categories behind and strive towards something new, and to become ungovernable in order for the capitalist system not to appropriate these categories and use it for its own accumulation purposes. So I was wondering how you, or if you connect these sort of transgender Marxist ideas with ideas of how to struggle against a capitalist system that is tied to gender and race in specific ways. If you have some reflections on those ongoing struggles, I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe now
I think you can respond now, and then we'll questions from the audience after that.
Okay, no,
But
thank
I will
you.
stop you when it's like 15 minutes left.
No, I will try. No, yeah, exactly. I didn't want to speak too much because I have already taken a bit too much time. So thank you so much, Olivia, for these comments. These are really useful, and you touched an important point. The fact that I don't mention Silvia Federici in that chapter. I mean, to be totally honest, is I don't discuss much social reproduction in that chapter, but that is mainly because there was another chapter on social reproduction in the handbook, which I also contributed to write. So we write it with Titi Bhattacharya and Sue Ferguson. And so I said, okay, this chapter on gender, we leave aside social reproduction because we discuss it. You know, we give it already a lot of space in another chapter. So that was really the main reason also for the omission of Silvia Federici from this chapter, because we discuss her work in the chapter in social reproduction. But also, I mean, to be honest, now you make me think about this. In a way, I wish I had engaged. To be honest, I think Silvia Federici does say things on gender specifically, and I wish I had engaged for this chapter with her work in Caliban and the Witch, because I think that actually has a lot of interesting things about the regulation of women's bodies in the transition to capitalism. So I will just leave it here to say that I haven't thought too much about this in the context of writing on gender, but I think you're right. I think it would be important to do that and not just to engage with her when it comes to social reproduction, strictly speaking. So I think that's something I might do. And also to say, I mean, if you read the chapter, it's very long. It took me a long time to write that chapter. I had to engage with lots of debates I didn't know at all. So I also decided that because I've written several things on gender, also in the context of femonationalism and social reproduction, that I think I am actually writing a book on gender and capitalism, partly collecting some of these writings and revising them, etc., and partly trying to think through these issues a little bit more in depth. And I will try to make sure to include more on Silvia Federici. So the other question is on production and reproduction. I personally, I mean, I guess unconsciously, one reason why I don't discuss too much Silvia Federici is because I tend to agree with the other side in the debate on whether social reproduction produces value or not. I think my position is closer to Lise Vogel. I don't think that social reproductive labor produces value from a capitalist point of view, but two things that maybe I want to say here. I think there is an article which I found very useful by Rivera, I can't remember her first name. It's published a few years ago in Spectre, and she tries to clarify this debate. And I think she very clearly says the production of the commodity labor power responds to very different laws than the production of commodities. And so we need to understand that really social reproduction in that sense functions differently. It's really in this limbo between market and non-market relations. And I think that's actually an important point, not just from, if you like, a technical point of view, but also from a political point of view. I think it's important, there are important implications that we can derive from subtracting social reproduction entirely from capitalist value production. And one is that really social reproduction, the reason why I love to think through this is because it's one of those realms that I think can also help us to think beyond capitalism. A lot of work of social reproduction is, as some people say, is the labor of love, is the care, the way we take care of children, take care of older people. We do things that we can imagine doing in a different way. We do things also for passion and for precisely the reproduction of social relations. And in that sense, I think it's also important politically to preserve, to think through social reproduction what an alternative to capitalism can be. On the last question, very briefly, I mean, this is obviously, well, maybe very briefly on transgender Marxism. I'm not an expert on this, to be honest. I read this book, Transgender Marxism. I want to learn more on this because I think it's fascinating. I want to try to work more on this in the context of the book I was talking about. So this is just to say, I think these scholars really pose such an important challenge for us, not just because of what they say and what they say about Marx and what the analytic challenge, but I think it's also an important political challenge because of the discussions that are going on at the moment in many countries, the oppression that transgender people are subjected to, the way in which they are the target of fascism and far-right organizations. So there is, again, as I said, gender is this key battlefield that we need to fully understand, and I think transgender issues are really very much at the heart of that. So yeah, I will maybe close it here. Thank you, Olivia.
Okay, so now we will open up for